Again, in Proverbs 23:35, we are reminded that alcohol becomes habit forming and brings one into a self-destructive mode of living. In Proverbs 31, verses 4 and 5, political and judicial leaders are told not to drink wine or other forms of alcohol so they will not corrupt and pervert law and justice. In Proverbs 31, 6 and 7, we find the only real Old Testament sanction for alcohol. And it was to be given as a form of a deadening pain, obviously to deaden pain for those about to die and for those in deep clinical depression. And by the way, I think it's very obvious today that there's many other forms of medicines that are better, but here is your one only example that you're going to find that the Bible in any way seems to sanction alcohol. Now, that's very interesting because you go on in Ecclesiastes 2, verses 3 to 11, you find that King Solomon shares some of his personal experiences of how alcohol brought him only emptiness into his life. Again, in Ecclesiastes 10, verse 17, a special blessing is promised to nations who have political leaders who will turn away from drunkenness. In Isaiah 5:11, a pronouncement of calamity and disaster is placed upon those who drink and become inflamed by alcohol. According to Isaiah 5, verses 11 to 13, drinking parties only lead to captivity and destruction of honorable people. According to Isaiah 5, 11 to 13, alcohol has caused the destruction of multitudes of people. It goes on to say that even hell has enlarged itself, literally enlarged itself, because of the multitudes of people descending into hell because of the consequences of alcohol. Again, in Isaiah 5 and verse 22, another pronouncement of calamity and disaster is placed upon those who boast in their consumption of alcohol and mixed drinks as they try to appear to be champions or heroes. And I think this is so sad when you consider how many young people watch football games or basketball games or baseball games, and they'll break to the commercial, and in many cases they're alcohol commercials, and sometimes these kids look to these people as heroes, and obviously the way that the commercials display the advertisements made it to appear as if these people are the happiest people and the healthiest and the sexiest and the strongest and the most popular and the wealthiest, et cetera, et cetera. And even you see them in billboards or in magazine ads, and they're constantly giving off the image, as you see displayed here in these two magazine ads, that it's associated with partying and sexuality and sensuality. And yet the Scripture warns against that. Again, in Isaiah 22, verses 12 to 13, we find that drinking alcohol develops fatalism in people's lives. In Isaiah 24, verse 9, it shows that drinking alcohol causes depression and bitterness. In Isaiah 28, verse 1, another pronouncement of calamity and disaster is placed on drunkards and those who have been overcome with wine. And then in verse 3, God warns that the drunkards in their pride will be trodden down. And then you skip down to verses 7 to 8, and we're told how even ministers have gone into error because of wine. When you look closely at the same passage here in Isaiah 28, we're told that ministers have become swallowed up and destroyed by the use of wine, and how that they've strayed out of the way because of their deception of the various forms of alcohol. And Isaiah is referring to those that are ministers. Again, he refers here in the same passage in Isaiah 28, 7 and 8, that we're told how drinking alcohol brings ministers into spiritual blindness and how it causes them to stumble in their judicial responsibilities. And that we see the end results of drinking wine and various forms of alcohol is vomit and filthiness, which, by the way, folks, is really the only way that you can be honest about this. And how many times do you ever see it displayed that way? You never see alcohol shown with people being sick and vomiting and sticking their head down the toilet and just barfing and having all these negative effects? Absolutely not, because obviously it would give off a negative connotation, which obviously the world doesn't want that side. Again, in Isaiah 56, verses 10 through 12, a very strong rebuke is given to pastors and spiritual leaders for their fixation and their use of various forms of alcohol. In Jeremiah 35, verses 5 to 8, and then in verse 14, God commended the father of a family for helping them take a stand against alcohol and for their commitment to total abstinence from it. Well, it's a remarkable story. You need to check that out. In Ezekiel 44, verse 21, we read that one of the requirements for priests to minister before the Lord is to not drink wine. In Daniel 1, verse 5 and 8 and 16, we read of young Daniel and his 3 young companions who determined to not defile themselves by drinking alcohol. And would to God we had more young people that would take this stance, that would take a strong stance, even in the midst of big, heavy-duty pressure. By the way, you read later on in Daniel chapter 5, verses 1 to 4, how King Belshazzar had started drinking, and he did this before hundreds of his people, setting a horrible example for these other men and women to follow, which obviously they ended up doing. And he becomes bold in his acts of mockery toward the things of God while under the influence of alcohol. And as a result, the people started to drink wine too, and they began to praise and worship the false gods. It tells us there in Daniel 5. Again, in Hosea chapter 3 and verse 1, God speaks of the adulterous woman who was a lover of wine. In Hosea 4:11, we find that sexual immorality and alcohol go hand in hand because they take away the heart, the scripture teaches. Hosea 7:5, a king and his people are reproved because of drinking of alcohol. In Joel 1:5, drunkards and those drinking alcohol are told to wake up and weep and wail because of their alcohol. In Joel 3:3, we are told of people who would actually sell their children for alcohol so they might be able to drink more. And then the horrible connection of alcoholism and how it ends up making husbands and wives, and obviously moms and dads, do horrible things to one another and their families to continue this horrible act of alcoholism in their lives. It's just a tragedy. But what we're talking about today is what the Bible plainly says about it. In Amos chapter 2, verse 8, it refers to drinking the wine of the condemned in the house of a false god. In Amos 2:12, a clear condemnation is pronounced against those who gave alcohol to people who have dedicated themselves to God. In Amos 4:1, it speaks of those who drank alcohol were the same who had oppressed the poor and crushed the needy. In Amos 6:1-6, a judgment is placed on those who party and drink alcohol, which in turn cause them to become careless and unconcerned for the things of God. In Nahum 1 verse 10, it records the sudden destruction of drunkards. In Habakkuk 2:5-8, it speaks of a man because he commits sin with wine, is called a proud man, a destroyer of his home, and will never have his desire satisfied. Again, in Habakkuk chapter 2, 5-8, a whole nation will be heaped up with violence and blood because of the treacherous nature of alcohol. And I think that could be definitely applied to what we have in our own country here in America. In Habakkuk 2:15, a pronouncement of calamity and disaster is placed on anyone who gives someone alcohol. In Habakkuk 2:15-16, a person who gets someone drunk to shame them, God will see to it that they're also put to shame. Now in the New Testament, we see here in Matthew 24, Jesus is talking, verses 48-51, a clear warning is given to those who eat and drink with drunkards, that they will not be ready for the coming of Christ, and that their subsequent end will be torment in hell. Read that passage, it's very clear.